There was yet another Path of Exile 2 interview recently, but I've not yet covered it, which is not like me at all. And there's a very real reason why I decided not to post a video about it on this channel. And that's because it contained no real new information. Sure, it was an hour or so long, and we did learn a little tidbit about how strength now provides a little bit more than it used to for characters to try to beef up those people going into melee. But besides that, that's really it. And there's been a lot of discourse about this, how Path of Exile 2 interviews might be rehashing old information, or not going as deep as they can into Path of Exile 2 and instead focusing on Path of Exile 1, and a slew of other points of discussion. And in today's video, I'd like to discuss just that. If you like this type of content, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the sub notification bell. I am on the road to 25,000 subscribers before the end of the year. I think I'm going to be able to do it, but only with your help and support. Thank you. So everyone, let's briefly talk about the problem here. Obviously, Path of Exile 2 has been in its development phase for quite a long while, and Grinding Gear Games is a very communicative company. They like to talk with the community, with content creators, and even with other developers in the space and share their ideas, share information, and discuss the journey the game is taking. They're very transparent, and some of that does seem to bite them in the butt sometimes, unfortunately, especially when it comes to these long-form interviews in which some interviewers have very different interviewing styles, and some segments of the community don't seem to understand that. So I'd like to first take a look at what interviewers should do if they manage to nail one of these Grinding Gear Games interviews, whether it's with Jonathan Rogers, Mark Roberts, maybe it's someone else on the PoE2 development team. What should they really focus on and make sure that they do in preparation for said interview? Of course, I am speaking from the point of view of someone who has interviewed Jonathan Rogers twice now, and of course, I've made mistakes, and we'll get to those mistakes in good time. Step number one, if you do manage to get one of these interviews, is to know your audience. This answer will guide everything else in the interviewing process. And I'm not necessarily saying know your audience as in Jonathan Rogers. He's not your audience, he's your interviewee. I mean the people you mean to communicate to when you make this interview. Who are you aiming to show this to? Is it new players? Is it veteran players? Is it people who are on the fence about PoE2? Is it people who have played Diablo 4, played PoE 1, and bounced from PoE 1? Is it people who have never gamed before? There are a lot of different factors here, and we've seen a lot of different interview styles and interviewers based on this very facet. And of course, I did quite a bit of prep, and I knew exactly who my audience was going to be. They were the Path of Exile 2 superfans. I did as much prep as possible going into my interview. I wanted to make sure that I was really asking no repeat questions, no questions that other interviewers had asked leading up to mine. I wanted to go in with wholly unique, wholly original topics, only repeating questions which I thought were worthwhile based on recent new information. For example, I asked about beta and early access because just a few days before it was announced that it was being delayed until later in the year instead of being on June 7th. So I thought, hey, it's worthwhile to ask about this, ask if there's a difference between early access and closed beta now, and Jonathan gave a great answer on that. Piece of advice number two for people who may interview Jonathan, right? It's to mentally and physically prepare yourself, okay? It's quite the experience getting to sit down with a game developer and talk about their game. You need to make sure that you are in the right headspace for that moment. Make sure you have a physical notebook beside you. Make sure your monitors are all set up. Make sure your OBS studio is good, your mic is set. Decide whether or not you're going to have chat up while doing the interview or if you're going to ignore it entirely. I will say make sure you have someone who's watching chat in your messages, so if there is something wild going on, as we'll talk about soon enough, you will be able to see it. And number three, over-prepare. So this feeds into number one, know your audience. You want to make sure when you're going into this interview, you might have an hour, 2 hours to talk to the developer. You want to make sure that you over-prepare based on what your audience really wants to find out. if you're catered to new players, okay, this interview isn't going to be for those veterans who know everything about the game. So make sure that you go over these selling points of Path of Exile 2. Go over all those broad, generic questions that Jonathan, yes, has answered many times over, because all these people that you'll be showing this to, whether it's on your channel or on your news site, will be hearing all this stuff for the first time. You know, there were a lot of people who interviewed Jonathan at the console event that haven't posted their interviews yet. I know that SkillUp interviewed Jonathan Rogers. I know that DM interviewed Jonathan Rogers. And I'd be very curious to see if, since Jonathan was interviewed by so many different people during that event, including Captain Lance, including myself, including Ghazi, including Catmaster and Balor Mage, how all these people had very different interview styles and if they were trying to cater to different audiences. Using myself as an example, I really wanted to hone in on what the console players wanted, so I went to all the places where I knew that they congregated. The Path of Exile 2 subreddit, the PoE Discord, on my channel, on Twitter. I was trying to gather as many console questions as possible so that I could talk to Jonathan about exactly those, because that was the focus of the event, and that is what the audience wanted to hear, or at least my particular chosen audience that I wanted to communicate that information to. But really, you want to over-prepare for said audience. Have a huge number of questions for Jonathan, have follow-up questions, have the answers you think you're going to get, and anything that you might want to touch on in addition to that. You know, Zizarin really laid the groundwork for this. I was watching his stream when he was prepping for the Jonathan Rogers and Mark Roberts interview, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is a great little scenario here. You just have your sheet, you have your answer, you have the supposed answer to the question, you have follow-ups, you have the category, you rank them by priority. Do all that. Really, I think if you get the opportunity to do this, if you really want to do it well, you prepare, you over-prepare, and you make sure that you do not squander the opportunity, because grinding your games is giving you their time. You want to make sure that you respect their time and respect the time of your audience as well. Okay, and let's talk about the big no-nos, what not to do during these interviews. Number one, okay, and I experienced this firsthand, don't negate audio prep. Spend 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes at the beginning if you need to make sure you talk to your audience who's watching live, or if it's not live, make sure that the audio is set up right. Do a little test recording on your device, listen back to it, make sure that it all sounds good. Because in my first interview with Jonathan, I decided to say, hey, I'm not going to read chat. I'm just going to go in blind. I'm going to talk to Jonathan. We're going to be great. I didn't go in blind. I went in very prepared, but I wasn't going to read the live reactions to the interview itself. And that was a huge mistake on my part. I at least should have been watching my moderators messaging me, because I would have found out, hey, you're positively affirming too much. You're talking over Jonathan, and the mic levels were a little off balance, so it sounded like I was overpowering him. But I really didn't want to do that, and I learned from that experience for my second interview. But oh my gosh, then my second interview, the mic was all messed up because I was using my phone. It wasn't a last minute thing, but we didn't have proper recording devices there, and I was tapping my pen on the table and people heard a clicking noise. So you got to make sure that you're calm, collected, and that you test the environment you're going to be recording in beforehand, because we're always going to go back to the audience. You want the audience to have the best viewing experience possible. And then number two, don't speak over the interviewee too much. Especially with grinding your games, they don't like to give, little one-off answers, one sentence and done, especially if you give them a question that they can actually run with, okay? And that's what you want to do in a lot of these interviews. With Path of Exile 2, with a lot of questions being repeated and them not wanting to showcase new information unless they explicitly tell you, hey, we're going to show you new information for this particular interview, you want to ask them broader questions that they can run with and talk about at great length. And then in those answers, that's when you can hone in and try to get little bits of new information there. I did this with ascendancy classes in my interview with Jonathan. He didn't want to give any new tidbits about any ascendancies, but I was able to weasel my way in there because we were talking about the greater design philosophy of ascendancies, and he ended up saying, yeah, there's actually this sorceress ascendancy class that I am so excited about, and it's overpowered and it's so busted, and oh man, should I talk about it? Should I not? So it was just a great moment. I really enjoyed it. And if you give them this is a bad way of looking at it, but if you give them enough rope to hang themselves with, you'll get some new tidbits of juicy information out of them. And then number 3, and this is something that I think everyone who has interviewed them thus far has been guilty of to some degree, and that is focusing not on PoE2, but on Path of Exile 1. When we get these interviews in which we're specifically supposed to talk about Path of Exile 2, leave Path of Exile 1 out of it unless it's integral to the question that you're asking. Jonathan Rogers does not want to give PoE2-centric interviews and then talk about Path of Exile 1 most of the time. This is an opportunity for us to get new information or to spread the information we already know about PoE2 to more people. Use that time that they have given you to do just that. So the clock is ticking until the early access of Path of Exile 2 is upon us, and I'm sure there will be many new interviews with Jonathan and other members of the development team. I myself am pitching an interview about Path of Exile 2 right now, focused wholly around new players. And honestly, as we get closer and closer to Path of Exile 2's early access, that's what I would recommend new interviewers do. They really pick a topic and they try to go deep on that and let the developer elaborate as much as possible. Talk about endgame once that's available. Talk about class design. Talk about the skills, right? Don't try to do rapid fire questions or anything like that. Really let the developers and Jonathan, the game director, sit there and discuss at length what they think is best for the game and why they're making the choices that they are and why they're listening to the community when they do. I think those are when we get the best interviews. And even if the interview has rehashed information, if it's sculpted for the right audience, and I'm sorry everyone watching this video, sometimes you are not the target audience, as long as it's sculpted to that right audience, it's gonna hit, it's gonna succeed, and it's going to further increase everyone's excitement for Path of Exile 2. Like I said at the top of the video, make sure to hit the like button if you enjoy this type of content. Hit the subscribe button too, because I'm trying to get to 25,000 subs. And make sure you watch another video on this channel right now if you do love Talkative Try content. Anyways, that's all for this one. Talkative Exiles.